Hey humans, how's it going? Susan Ruth here. Thanks for listening to another episode of Hey Human Podcast. This is episode 420 and my guest is Ellie Kahn. Ellie is a multi-hyphenate human. She's a psychotherapist, producer, journalist, and historian, more specifically an oral historian, a collector of humanity's triumphs and sorrows. She's the founder of Living Legacies Productions and helps create meaningful books for people and their families to preserve their history for generations to come. She also works with foundations to help collect stories of groups of people and make sure that those stories are not forgotten. Really interesting woman, definitely a kindred spirit, and I so enjoyed talking with her. I met her by happenstance. She was sitting behind me at lunch one day, and we got to talking and found that we had storytelling in common and history of humans in common. So I'm looking forward to you hearing this episode. General stuff, Hey Human Podcast is now on YouTube under Official Susan Ruth. I'm on Patreon at Susan Ruthism. That's SUSANRUTHISM. And this Saturday, 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, I'm going to be hosting a Patreon Zoom. So anybody can sign in and say hello and we can chat. So if you haven't signed up for my Patreon, now's your chance. TikTok can be found Susan Ruthism, having fun trying to figure that one out. Check out heyhumanpodcast.com for links and to learn more about my guests and my show. Check out susanruth.com to learn about me and my other artistic endeavors. And follow Susan Ruthism and Hey Human Podcast on social media. You can find my music on Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, wherever you get your music. Rate and review and subscribe to Hey Human Podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Again, now on YouTube as well. And thank you for listening. Be well, be kind, be love. Here we go. Ellie Kahn, welcome to Hey Human.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi, it's so nice to see you.
Nice to see you too.
Your work, your life's work now, I don't know if we're going to find out if that's been your work the whole time, but it was very intriguing to me. It's right up my alley. So I'm excited to have you on the show.
Yeah, it's fun for me to talk about my work. So this is great.
Yeah. Well, let's go back to the beginning. Where are you from? Where did you grow up? And how did your environment shape you?
I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. I'm 75. And so it was a long time ago. I was really shaped by having wonderful grandparents and a father who was a storyteller. And I was very fortunate. My dad and I interviewed one of my grandfathers when I was in high school. I wish I remembered how that came about, but it's amazing to hear my grandfather's voice all these years later. And we interviewed him about his parents and what he knew about his family background and also his own life. So that was probably the beginning, but it didn't occur to me to become an oral historian then. I went to Malvern Elementary School, then I went to Woodbury Junior High School, then I went to Shaker Heights High School, then I went to Lake Forest College, and then I graduated from occupational therapy school at Ohio State. It came about because I volunteered with children with disabilities in high school. And then I heard about the fact that you could work with those kind of children as an occupational therapist. And I didn't end up doing that. It was my goal. But the first job I got was in a psychiatric setting as an occupational therapist.
What was that like?
It was interesting. It was truthfully, it was not really what I wanted to do. And I slipped into, deliberately, doing art therapy instead of occupational therapy at the hospital for 10 years where I worked. Woodview Calabasas Hospital. It's no longer around, but I was there for 10 years from 73 to 83.
I've actually been intrigued by art therapy for a while now. I've been poking around and reading up on it. Can you talk a little bit about it?
What I did at the hospital was offer patients a variety of art materials, whether that was clay or paints or colored pencils, and I would give them a prompt such as in any way you want, use the materials that call out to you to show how you're feeling today, or to represent something, a memory of your childhood, or something like that, which is interesting because those are the kind of questions I ask in my career now as an oral historian. The art therapy was really exciting because I also ran just a verbal therapy group with patients. And sometimes people who had a hard time talking in the verbal therapy group, when they had some image as a vehicle or a bridge to talk about what was going on with them, it was easier. I was very impressed with also the people I studied with who were art therapists. It was really wonderful. And I did it myself also, scribbling and seeing what image came out. That was till 1983.
In the movies, we see art therapy being used. Generally, it's kids drawing pictures of, their house is on fire, or daddy has big claws, or there's a monster in the closet. Does that happen in real life? Do kids draw like that when there is trouble afoot?
Well, I worked with adolescents and adults, not children. But yes, there were all sorts of images that, one time a woman drew a picture of herself as a tree strangling her father because she was feeling so powerless with him. And this was how she represented herself feeling more powerful. So those kind of images, it was those, you never knew what was going to come out, whether it was kind of realistic or abstract.
That's fascinating. I'm really, really intrigued by that work. Tell me how you began the process of collecting stories of other people, which, of course, I love.
Yes, I know you do. Well, when I left the job in 83, I went to, do you know about the book, What Color is Your Parachute? Have you heard of it?
I have heard of it.
That book, Richard Bowles, who wrote that book, was inspired by John Crystal. And he had a place in New York, the John Crystal Center, and I decided to go there for a week to a work-life planning course. And it was the kind of experience where you did a lot of exercises to discover who you were, what your skills were, what your interests were, what, turned you on. And it was a fluke. But at the end of the course, when they asked the question, if money was no object, what would you like to be doing? I said, I'd love to be a photojournalist. Now, I guess I should back up and say I had taken a photography class at the local junior college, and we had to find someone or several people to do a photo essay of them. So I did two things. One was a woman having her baby. So I took pictures of her in her yoga class, and then I got to go to the delivery of her baby and take pictures and made a kind of a collage of a photo essay for the class. The second person was a man named Frank Perkins, who lived in the park near my house in my apartment in Woodland Hills. He was a homeless man, and he and I got to talking. He looked like he was at a country club. He was tan, he was smoking a pipe, he had white hair, he looked very relaxed, and I followed him through his day and took pictures of him for a photo essay. So in the John Crystal course, they said to me, okay, you want to be a photojournalist, here's your homework. Take those photos that you took of this homeless man to the local newspaper. And so when I got home, I got up my courage and went to the Daily News or the Valley News. I forget what it was called at that time, in the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles, and showed them the pictures of Frank. And they said, we would really like to use these. We'll send someone out to interview him. And very impulsively, I said, oh, could I interview him? And that was the first article I ever wrote, which led to me becoming a freelance writer and journalist. And I still do some articles, but I was full-time freelance art, writer for the LA Times, for Travel and Leisure, for Parents Magazine. It's a wonderful career, as you know, because I could meet someone like a guy who was a ventriloquist on the street in Hollywood, and I could suggest that I write a story about him to the Herald Examiner. I wrote a lot for the old Herald Examiner, and they let me write an article about him. And it was just fabulous. So I had a wonderful time as a journalist. And I was in New Hampshire in 1988 with my mother. I heard about this woman who was very popular and famous in her neighborhood. She drove a yellow Mustang, and she always dressed in purple. They called her the Purple Lady. And I wrote an article about her for a magazine that was for older people, 50 plus, I think it was called. And somehow a friend said to me after she read that, "Do you know about the field of oral history?" And I did not know anything about oral histories. An oral history is something from ancient days when the elder of the tribe would tell a story about the tribe or about life or whatever. So I found a mentor named Gary Shumway, who taught at Cal State Fullerton, where they have an oral history program, and he became my mentor. And in 1988, I started doing oral histories, and that's been my career for over 35 years. I still do some freelance writing, but I practiced first on my parents. I interviewed both of them. And then I created a book from the interviews I did with them. And then I just started getting hired. In 1991, I was hired by the Jewish Historical Society to create an oral history of Boyle Heights and East Los Angeles, which had been a very large Eastern European Jewish community between World War I and World War II. And I taught volunteers to interview people who had lived in that community. How do you do interviews? How do you listen to people? How do you ask questions? And so that was part of what I was teaching these volunteers. From that, I produced a documentary film called Meet Me at Brooklyn and Soto that involved me interviewing about 50 people, including Zev Yaroslavsky, who grew up in Boyle Heights, and just wonderful, interesting stories and about getting to America and finding this community in Los Angeles where there were pickle barrels on the street and signs in Yiddish and lots of political arguments, communists and Trotskyites and whatever. And then I taught students from that. I decided to teach students to interview their grandparents. And that was at Palms Middle School. And one boy called his grandmother. It was actually to interview their grandparents or their parents if there weren't grandparents. So he interviewed his grandmother in Korea over the phone. And I had also been contacted by Spielberg's Shoah Foundation to do interviews with Holocaust survivors. Since they knew I was already an oral historian, I didn't really need to be trained to do it, but they had a fabulous training. And I interviewed a number of people who were already my clients. It was very interesting. They were all, of course, very moving interviews because many of the people's parents and families had all been killed during the Holocaust by the Nazis and Hitler. And so their stories were really important to be shared. And a lot of the ones who were my clients, they were hesitant to tell their children about their experiences because they didn't want to upset their kids. Their kids didn't want to ask their parents about their experiences because they didn't want to upset their parents. So I ended up, over the years, being kind of a bridge between them. And most of my oral history interviews end up being books. So I have it transcribed by people, and then I edit that and organize it into a book with photos from the family and documents. And one of my clients had a party with his grandchildren and nieces and nephews. He autographed the books and gave one to each of them. So, I mean, you can imagine what a wonderful career it is. It's like I meet the most fascinating people, and I feel good about the fact that so many people tell me, this is not what I feel good about. I feel very frustrated at how many people say, we kept meaning to interview my parents or my grandparents, and we were just so busy, we just never got around to it. Or we gave my grandmother a book to fill in, and she never got around to it. And there's just, I might not have interviewed my own parents had I not started doing this work. That makes me very sad when I hear that. I've given a gift to many friends as a birthday present to interview them or their parents, and it's a joy. And Zoom has changed things. Of course, I have clients in other states. I have clients in other countries, and it's like you can do it on Zoom, and then I record it so that the family has the recording. And sometimes that's all they want, and sometimes they want to have a book made, or I have edited videos over the years. And I did 2 other oral histories that were documentaries for Paramount Studios. I interviewed Cecil B. DeMille's granddaughter, Cece DeMille Presley, about him. And, she got to go to Egypt when he was producing the 10 Commandments. Then I interviewed a man who was at Paramount for many years, and he wandered around the lot, stopping people to tell them stories about the actors who'd come through Paramount. His name was A.C. Lyles. And so those oral histories were edited into videos. So it's a mixture, but mostly I make books. Hundreds of clients I have made the books for. And it's really fun to hand them to them, when they're done. But mostly, I get the gift of meeting all of these wonderful people.
Absolutely. And I mean, I've interviewed my parents for this show twice now.
Oh, wonderful.
Singularly each, twice.
Good.
My grandparents are long deceased, which is unfortunate. And they died when I was quite young. But you discover, and I mean the royal you, so much about your parents when you do that, when you interview them, because they have a world unto themselves that they'll never show if you don't ask. And it really is. I mean, the stories they told were so wild.
I bet.
We don't like to see our parents as human beings, I guess. And at some point, when you cross over to understand that they are their own autonomous people, that they have these lush lives.
Yeah, I'm so glad you did interview them. It's a very powerful experience. In terms of my interviews with people who've had traumatic experiences, I think being a licensed psychotherapist helps me be very, very comfortable if they are moved to tears or they can't talk, because of something and I say, are you sure you want to talk about this? Or it's okay if you want to stop. And one time a family had me interview everyone in the family because their sister was dying of cancer and she was at the interview. So I interviewed her, and I interviewed her sons about her, and I interviewed her sisters and her mother, all telling favorite stories about this woman who was dying of cancer. And then I sat her and her mother and sisters down because they said they really hadn't talked about how they were feeling about the fact that she was going to die soon. And I invited them to talk about it. And I was very moved. I have to kind of steady myself when people are talking about something very traumatic or moving, it's like I have to detach a bit, but still have compassion.
Yeah.
Things like that are very powerful for me. I have recordings that every time I visited my father, he was reminiscing. So I've got hours and hours and hours of interviewing him or just listening, recording him, So he influenced me a lot in terms of him. Both my parents knew about their family background, and I knew all my grandparents. Two of my grandparents, when they came from Hungary, moved to Omaha, Nebraska, and opened a saloon, which apparently wasn't uncommon for Jewish people, Jewish immigrants. Apparently, and this is, not a nice thing, but my grandmother was afraid of the Indians that were coming into the saloon. I mean, coming from Hungary, she had never experienced.
You're talking about indigenous peoples, right?
Indigenous people in Omaha, Nebraska, yes. Formerly called Indians and now called Native Americans. But in the story my dad told, it was, he said Indians. And so they moved to Cleveland, where there was family. And his joke was where there was a baseball team, formerly known as the Cleveland Indians.
And irony not lost, of course, yes. How has your taking in of all these stories from a pretty decent swath of humanity, how has taking in all these stories shaped you personally, changed you even?
I think that I've become even more interested in hearing people share things about themselves. And I find myself meeting people wherever I go and talking to them. My ex-husband said he had to stop me from picking up old people in the park, which of course now I am one of those. I think it's taught me patience, to be able to wait and just listen. And I think that I'm so awed by how people have gotten through things in their lives. And it makes me very grateful for my life and the things that I have in my life that are easy. I volunteered for a program in Brooklyn, the Sharing Network. It's a program for African American people in a housing development in Brooklyn. And I led reminiscence groups with them where I asked 5 or 6 people to talk about their family background. And there's nothing like hearing about people having to warn their African American sons to be careful walking down the street or being with their friends, to make me realize how I've never had to teach my son that at all. I've never had to be afraid of that. Their stories were very different than some of the other people I interview in terms of their recipes and their grandparents. And it was just a joy. It's a wonderful program because they still have lots of classes that are done all on Zoom. But the people are on their telephones talking from their apartments in this development. It was a privilege to spend about 8 months, getting to know people who had such different lives than I had.
It's so important, in my opinion, to hear the stories of those who are having different experiences than ourselves. It makes the world smaller. It develops empathy, which, my God, do we need that more than ever? Yeah, it's an honor, too. It's an honor to bear witness to the stories that people have. I am not always as good at not crying. I have definitely gotten emotional on a few interviews over the last 8 years, but for the most part, I'm able to hold it together. But every once in a while, I get pretty choked up.
Yeah, it's tough, but you're right. It is an honor. Absolutely. It's a privilege.
I worry that there are so many stories that we can't get them all, obviously, but that there's a whole generation that keeps leaving, and then the next that keep leaving, and they take with them such richness.
Yeah.
And then people forget.
Yeah, that's right. That was one of the reasons that I taught the kids to interview their grandparents, because that really could be part of every school, to have kids interact. It's also how often do kids spend a couple hours talking to their grandparents? But you're right. There's so many people who aren't getting a chance to reminisce and share and know that their stories will live on.
Yeah.
Which I think is very gratifying for a lot of people.
Yeah, a little bit of immortality.
I was hired by a man named Elliot Sturman. He found out that he had a brain tumor and he was in his 60s. And he hired me to sit behind him while he lay on one of his adult, no longer living at home, but his son's bed, reading his children's favorite childhood books, Cat in the Hat, Dr. Seuss, Calvin and Hobbes. And while he read, he was pointing out things in the book, just like you would read to a child. But he was better than I had ever been reading to my son. And what he said was that he will never know his grandchildren, and he wanted to be more than just a name to them or a picture on the wall. So this is what he left, all of these recordings of him reading all these books, for his kids to pass on someday.
That's beautiful. It's a great idea.
Yeah, it was fabulous. And that one, I had a hard time not crying.
Yeah.
He was talking about the fact that he would never know his grandchildren, and he died 6 months later.
Yeah, I've interviewed a couple people who are either dying and or at the very end of life.
Yeah.
And talk about humbling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. He interviewed a woman who was in hospice, and I couldn't go in because she was being kept in isolation, and we just talked on the phone. I'm still visiting my 90-something-year-old clients who've become friends. It's just, it's a privilege and fun.
And you can't capture all the stories at once. Like I said, I interviewed my parents twice now each, and they told different stories. I mean, tons of stories. So I got to hear all these different things that make them more human. More human I don't know. It's hard to explain how I feel about that, but because of your work. But for those listening, I could not recommend this more, to interview the people around you, because it's fascinating.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
What are you working on right now?
Well, last year I interviewed someone for 18 hours. He's in New Jersey. And it was by Zoom, and I edited it into a manuscript, which he's now reading through. And I have two other people who's I interviewed for about 9 or 10 hours each. So I'm editing those right now. I have a couple of clients in Israel who their project's been put on hold because their kids are in the army. And also I was hired by the world's oldest women's rowing club in Mission Bay, San Diego. And I got to go down there and interview people, and I got to go out rowing. And so now I'm still doing some Zoom interviews for that organization, which is their stories about their grandmother starting this rowing club in the close of the late 1800s, going out rowing in a barge. So that's been a really, really fun project.
Who's getting your story aside from me right now? But are you leaving your story as well?
I started to take an autobiography class through Santa Monica College Emeritus. So I have been writing my stories and my memoir things, and it's been really fun because some of them are about my mother and her dementia, and what we went through together when she had dementia, and about my father after he had his stroke, and the fact that it was a time when he needed help, which he didn't want. So it's about the relationship that I've had with my parents. I'm also writing about some of the men in my life from starting at 6 years old when one of my little friends kissed me in his closet.
As somebody that does capture stories, when you are faced with something as tragic as dementia that robs people of their stories and their history, how do you support that? Because of course, many of us have family members or loved ones who are going through that.
Well, if I interview the person who is in the early stages of dementia, which I've done quite often, they see that something's happening to them and they want, or their family says, let's get this done while you can. And it's very moving because they're scared of what's happening to them, the loss of control, and they don't know what's ahead. And they also feel what most people do, a relief to be able to share their stories and reminisce and cry if they need to cry, or laugh when something's funny. And with my mom, her dementia was gradual, and she still knew me until the end. So there were some very funny moments with her dementia. She was living in a boarding care where there were just 6 people. It's like a house with just 6. I used to joke and say they were inmates, but 6 residents. So they're sitting at the dining room table, and this woman is reading the paper. This is years ago, of course. And the woman says, oh my goodness, the Queen Mother died. And my mother said, really? How old was she? She says, let me look. Oh, she was 101. And my mother said, isn't that amazing? There's a pause. The woman says, wow, the Queen Mother died. And my mother said, really? How old was she? And the woman says, she was 101. And my mother says, really? That's incredible. So this went on about 3 times. And I had to leave the room because I was laughing. But I called my sister and told her, we had lots of conversations about my mom where I told her about the experience of, say, taking my mother to the movies and having her loudly say, what did she say? And other things like that. If we didn't laugh, we would just be crying about. But she still knew me till the end. I will tell you one other funny thing with her. She had a brother-in-law that she didn't like, and I took her to his funeral. And we're sitting in the front row, and everyone's very quiet. My mother loudly says, who died? And I hissed at her, Bob died. And she kind of giggled. We get after the funeral, we get to their house where, they're having food. And we're sitting there. I gave my mom a sandwich. We're sitting there. And my mother said, where are we? And I said, we're at Carol and Bob's house. She said, oh, where's Bob? And I said, we just buried him. And she just burst out laughing. So I have written for my own memoirs about those kind of stories. Actually, that was also published as an article. So some of my stories about my parents and what they went through, I've written as articles also. So that's fun.
That's straight out of a British comedy. Have you had people do what one would call a deathbed confessions to you?
People frequently say things that their family didn't know before, but I don't know if there would be anything I would call a deathbed confession. I don't think there's been anything that is quite that dramatic, but there's a lot that people have said that their family never knew before, and that they had been hesitant to tell their family.
I think it's interesting when you do what we do, that it really, aside developing empathy and listening skills, I think truly helps develop your non-judgmental side as well, because you can't be listening to someone's story and say, oh, how could you have done that? Or, oh my God. And to that point, when I interviewed my mom, one of the times I said, if you could do it all over again, would you have gotten married and had children? She had 3 children. And she said, absolutely not. And I could have taken that 2 ways. I could just accept it for that's the way she feels. And it has nothing to do with me. That's her life she's talking about. Or I could have gotten really pissed off. But I actually found it pretty funny because I already knew the answer, I think, and somewhere in the back of my mind. But it really does teach you along the way that everyone is really just doing the best they can with what they've got.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. Yeah. Absolutely. It's funny about your mom. I have just once or twice when I sent the recording to a client, they've said, please remove this part. I don't want my family to know that. That's happened so rarely out of, 35 years of hundreds of interviews, maybe 2 times. And I was surprised and sorry that they felt, that they were so unhappy about having shared that. And of course, I kept it. It was everything's confidential,
Yeah, it's hard not to dance at the shame prom sometimes.
The other thing I'm doing is, as a gift to a friend, I'm interviewing on Zoom his older sister and her husband. But their 3 children are present, and her 2 siblings are present. And so it's a whole family thing. And, like you were saying about interviewing of one's parents, everyone's asking questions. It's not just me asking the questions. And it's really been fun because they have memories that the stars of the show don't have, and so and their version of things growing up. So it's been really fun.
That's so cool. What a great idea.
Yeah, it's really been fun.
Tell people how they might find you out there in the world.
Well, I have a website, Living Legacies, plural, productions, plural.com, or they can email me, E like elephant, K like king, Z like zebra, mail, MAIL, @gmail.com.
Perfect. I'll put links for people too. And are your books available on Amazon?
No, these are just for the family.
Oh, okay.
Yes. And I think for that reason, people feel very comfortable that this is private, that, this is just for the family. So there have been people who have ordered books and given them to friends, and other people, but no, we don't publish them on Amazon.
Okay. But your own memoir will be.
No, I'm doing that just for fun.
Oh, really? Okay.
No, that's interesting. In the autobiography class that I'm in, there have been published authors in that class who have written, their memoirs and put them on Amazon. So, but no, you make an interest. I'm going to think about that.
I'd read it.
I think some of the stories that I've written for the class would be fun for people to read.
I mean, we learn and grow with each other. Yeah. And your experiences will help shape other people who may end up going through the same thing or are going through the same thing now. I cannot stress that enough as well, that we are all just here to be mirrors to each other.
You're so good at what you do, Susan.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed spending the time with you.
Well, I take that as a huge compliment given what you do. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Rate, review, and subscribe to Hey Human wherever you find your podcasts. Thanks. Bye.